In the world of indie games in particular, standing out is key. You gotta have some unique draw to distinguish yourself from the rest of the huge library of games releasing every day on any platform you are on, especially Steam. One of the smartest ways that have been used lately is GIFable clips, 5 to 10 second segments that draw the eye with some amazing action or surprising feature. That's how I believe Fight Night got its initial attention. But here's the real question. Can it keep up the fight after rounds 4 through 8, or even round 9 through 12? Fight Night released on November 30th, 2021 for the price of $19.99. It's available on the Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, and Steam, and has you punching everything left and right like a fist of a North Star fight. It's a dungeon crawler focused on melee combat, specifically introducing your enemies to your knuckles. But before I begin, this key was obtained from the developer for the purposes of review. That won't change my opinion of the game in the end, but you should know that because of FTC guidelines, as well as the whole morals thing, you know? I also need to address an issue from the get-go. This game is surrounded in a controversy surrounding a developer and former contributors and people connected to the game, dealing with allegations of sexual assault and other issues. I will leave links in the description below to both sides of the controversy so you can educate yourself, as I do realize that when it comes to a purchasing decision, that is a criteria for some to buy, which is why I mention it in this review. However, I will not go into detail regarding it, as this review will focus on the game and product itself, as I don't think talking about the details in a review can lead to an unbiased opinion about the product itself. Fight Night is about a titular knight falling into a world being corrupted sorts, and a tower that overlooks the world filled with evil. You know, typical fantasy affair. There's a town that you start with, which will build over time, complete with a captain and a ship, which serves as your headquarters, a lighthouse, and a couple of local businesses that seem to need you to help with finding their owners for reopening. But that's basically the premise of the game. Big evil tower. Climb evil tower. Save people. Find more story. ... Profit. Well, I'll get to the story in a little bit. Let's start around what you're probably here for in the first place, the gameplay. And let's specifically talk about the combat. The combat keeps things somewhat simple, focusing on basic punching, guarding, and dodging. Punching is just a simple hit of the spacebar, and hitting it multiple times will allow for a series of punches. Now, you can auto-punch with V, but let me tell you, beyond the initial level or two, you'll just stick with the spacebar to allow for the flow to other punches and not the awkwardness of the V key, such as the uppercut that you'll perform by dodging back and hitting punch, which will launch you forward and punch, or a more swinging overhead punch that can sometimes knock enemies down and stun them for a second. Kind of. It can be hard to see what the overhead punch does at times, but I find it useful to get a hit in while running forward. You do have hooks to the left and right that can be useful as well, knocking enemies into walls or into the other lane in this 2-lane system. However, there's an emphasis on dodging and blocking in the game as well, and the just mentioned 2-lane system. You can see enemy attacks coming as they will change color depending on if they are going to hit you or not. You can see that you're dodging out of the way with WASD by noticing it go from the changed color back to the normal color, or in certain cases, walking into attack will also change the color. You can, however, block those attacks by holding shift, and it will block damage from some, but not always all, enemy damage depending on the enemy. However, if you block just before the enemy hits you, you will parry, which will knock them back, and you may, or may not, get some time to damage them without reprisal. However, some enemies will take multiple parries in a row in order to get that status. The combat shines when using the enemy variety and the different strategies in conjunction with one another. You can't just focus on dodging everything, for example, and floating like a butterfly, stinging like a bee, and not bother parrying. Or just going balls to the walls aggressive and not consider the enemy types along the way. The game will punish you, and you have to adjust in every case. In fact, the game will challenge you with enemies that will require specific punches and kicks to get around wooden shields, for example, or will change your timing to hit an explosive football back in a way that an enemy can't just catch it again. The game slowly builds this up in the first level or two, and while it may take some time to get there, when it starts really switching up enemies and challenging you from fight to fight, it can be exhilarating. It can be a lot of fun. Now, the enemies here are rather simple. They have an optimal strategy to beat them, a strategy that will work on them a little bit, and certain moves that will absolutely get you crushed. The trick here is that enemies will come in groups, however, and specifically in different combinations, which may lead to a different strategy, even if it's not optimal for one particular type. Enemies can overshadow other weaknesses of their allies, and there are moments where you'll have to think about how you're going to deal with it. Even numbers can make a huge difference. For example, taking on these flies in the mid-game was fine when they started with 2 or 3 of them, with me having to parry those projectiles in order to not have more enemies on the screen to deal with. That's what the projectiles are, actual flies. But in the later game, when that changes to 6 to 8 to start with, you note that staying the front and trying to parry with all those enemies right there actually will be a problem. You can't parry everything, and it'll get you killed because there'll just be more spawning and more spawning and more spawning. So you'll have to step back and just dodge and parry over and over again to whittle down numbers, because it reflects the actual fly back at the enemy. The game punishes you hard for trying to not adjust. You'll note on the screen right now, in one case, what happens if you don't actually change your strategy. You'll end up with so many items due to all the creatures that spawn that you'll feel like you just went through a war. But it can lead to some problems from a game design perspective. I give the game all the credit in the world for the unique enemies and presentation in this 2-lane system, dealing with different enemy heights, designs, and making it feel special when you came across a different enemy. But certain numbers and enemy combinations can be so deadly that you end up wanting to scream. Like not being able to actually visually see a charging shark because the big guys in the front are obfuscating the screen enough where you can't actually see them. It's not always easy to see what you have to do in certain situations, and it leads to other problems, specifically combined with the game's exploration and puzzle systems. It's its ability to throw different enemy variations and force different strategies out of you, however, may come one of Fight Night's biggest problems, dealing with the JRPG-like random battles that you fight. Actually, I'm not even sure if they're random. See, if you do a section over and over again, and do the same moves as you did before in terms of the overhead map, about 80% of the time, you'll find the random enemies at the same spot that you did before. It feels like it's based off an in-game clock or a preset number of tile movements, cause going on a more efficient path seems to mean you get further without hitting an enemy. And yes, you're not gonna wanna hit enemies. So what's wrong with the random encounters? Well, like I mentioned, every enemy has an optimal strategy of sorts, and when combined together, you'll have to change things up. This has the strength of having to adjust and things feeling fresh. But where this becomes an issue is the healing, potion, and save system. See, you're not going to be able to get it right every time, and you'll take damage here and there to trying to figure out exactly what to do, and especially if you don't get the optimal strategy that the game is throwing at you. This starts to whittle down your resources, and eventually, you'll be in the dungeon in the middle of it without any healing to fall back upon. Okay, so you just get back to the start, go get some healing and return, right? Well, that's if you can do that. In some levels, it's just not possible. You'll have to make your way back through a labyrinth if you haven't found a switch that opens the level to create a shortcut. Most of the time, in fact, you'll just end up fighting forward because going back doesn't make a lot of sense, and you'll probably die. In fact, you'll die and be forced to try to remember all the things you did on the last run so you can be more efficient in the later runs. That's if you remember things. This is a game that really requires you to sit down and do one dungeon at a time, because good luck remembering the layout if you stop the game and start it up the next day. It's so twisting and turning with a tight level design without necessarily having standout markers to mark specific places for you to reference. Two of the worst levels are the jungle treetop level and the fire and ice level. You'll get turned around left and right, wonder where you've gone, and at certain points you'll just give up because you'll keep on running into enemies, losing a little bit of health, and you're just confused. You don't feel like you're making progress, and there's nothing you can really do about it except try again. Does that mean the exploration and puzzle elements themselves are flawed in nature? No. In fact, some parts of them are rather nice and are a standout in the game. The puzzle element shines in areas like the sand level, where walking in front of certain statues will throw you into a pit, and you have to find the right path in order to make it into the next section. In this case, when you did have to go back to the start of the level design wasn't as annoying. And while the game doesn't necessarily call out the range of the statues at first, it teaches you little by little about it, and that's great game design. Then there were clever inclusions for optional items to get, going in front of a statue purposefully after figuring out the right coordinate to get a new potion to use. This kind of design makes you feel like a winner and makes you feel like, yeah, I'm doing great. Even the levels I had major problems with, the ice and fire level being the big example, on their own with the exploration was good. I liked having to figure out how to slide to get to the next area in the ice, even when it wasn't necessarily easy to figure out where I needed to go. I mean, I don't expect a big arrow this way, but I do expect the design to push me in the direction at times. But nevertheless, figuring out how to move in the heat and cold was fun. At first. If there's anything I want to emphasize in this review, it's mechanic synergy. You can have good to great systems that have reasonable flaws, that can be put together in a way that can actually make a fantastic game. Each of the systems end up pulling together to hide other flaws and enhance each other like a great team would. It's like the Oakland A's of the Moneyball era. A bunch of good players, not great, but combined in a way to succeed in Major League Baseball. Unfortunately for Fight Night, we have the opposite effect, where combinations of certain elements end up actually causing more pain and suffering for a player to the point where they're bashing their keyboard. Great, I got a new armor set that focuses on strikes in combat and regaining health, and less about special attacks, limiting my skills to only one and costing a lot of health to use. On the surface, that's great. Having armor sets with such different playstyles and strengths is cool, and it was cool to play in some of the different ones throughout the game, especially when it provided an advantage in a boss fight. But what ends up costing it is the enemy variety, which is the strength of a game, but it's the type of gameplay that you have to do to adjust to it. The problem exists in how you have to deal with defense in certain cases. Take for example this more shielded enemy that holds up his defenses a lot more. These enemies can be vastly annoying to play against, but can be overcome with things like the ground pound to stun them. But remember that armor, we only have one move, and you may have to focus more on the small periods of time that you can damage them if you didn't take that ground pound. And it starts to drag things out in that case. So you switch armors, right? but you may not have the right skill for the other armor, or it may not give you the strength that you need. You end up going back to the original armor a lot, because while it may not have some certain strengths, it definitely doesn't have certain weaknesses, and the game screams that you need variety. This then drags everything else around it. Boss fights are great for the most part. They test your skills, they push you to your limit, and while they'll probably take 4 to 5 times, especially in the mid-game, in order to do them, you'll still want to take them on because you're having fun until you hit that wall, where frustrations like what I mentioned with the level design and the health and the restart and some of the skills, they all start to chip away at you. Then you end up getting more and more frustrated, to the point where a fun boss fight, even though nothing has changed, it feels like a chore, where you consider going to the accessibility options to slow down the fight speed, because you really just don't want to go through the bullshit of learning little by little again and again after you just got through doing it 10 times before. When you're that frustrated with the gameplay, it's hard to see things like the writing, which creates an interesting world dynamic that fits somewhere between, I don't know, Monty Python and Shovel Knight of sorts. You have fun and interesting characters, like the Mantis twins. Well, I think they're mantises and I think they're twins. They just sort of run the shop of the library together. They are an interesting polar pair in both design and personality, but you're able to connect with them thanks to small details like the use of nicknames that keep on changing when you interact with them. Looking back, there's some clever ideas here with the hockey versus football nature of the ice and fire leaders, and a knight who's never lost until you've come around. And sure, the regular story is sort of typical of a fantasy tale. Well, up until the last portions of the game, that's for sure. But the writing is still pretty good for this genre in particular. You don't get a lot of games like this that even try to incorporate the story that this one is trying to do, and Fight Night succeeds in that, as long as you're still fighting through the struggle of the overall game design. Normally, in a review like this, I wouldn't be harping on a single point time and time again, even through other sections of the review, despite it being central to their execution. But I feel it's important to show how much this frustration affected my play sessions. There were times in this game where I didn't make progress to save after opening a new door or hitting a switch to unlock a new area for 2 to 4 hours at a time. I was just going at the same thing over and over again, maybe making a tiny bit more progress, but not a lot. When writing this review, I hated the fact that this point kept coming up, but I ultimately left it in there, because it's necessary for me to show the bias that frustration caused and how it negatively impacted even elements, like the visual style, that I thought were strong overall. I like a lot of the visual designs of enemies here. I like the detail put into shifting sands, and even with the color palettes being restricted on levels to keep an overall style and specific ecosystem. It worked in making the tower not only feel unnatural, but also a little bit earthy at the same time. It felt like the right choice, but then the frustration would come back. I think there are ways to help you get through those frustrations if you still want to play, and those will definitely show in the enhancers section of this review. I'll give one of them right now: play with a controller. Funny enough, I started playing with the keyboard and never got out of it, and it's not bad per se. Punching, blocking, and dodging are just fine, but when getting to the special attacks and the unique special menu that rotates around, and you've got to move to the right one you want, it was always finicky at best. It feels like making things more complicated for the sake of complication, but I get they wanted to keep things on the lower part of the keyboard, at least I think that's why they did it. It just makes a lot more sense to use the controller in this case, because the menus, well, they sort of make more sense in that case. Sound design is 85% hit and 15% miss for me, but this actually came down to a few small things that feel a little bit more subjective. Like, I get it, everybody loves Banjo-Kazooie, and some people will love the random sounds when talking like that game that come out of these characters' mouths. but it ended up being, personally for me, like scratching a chalkboard. But in battle, there's good sounds for being grabbed, enemies attacking. The design in this part gives you the information that you need, and the sounds are quality. There isn't something that doesn't sound right in terms of what they are going for the sound itself. It's just that you will also hate a sound or two, not because of that quality, but because you'll want to stuff a Q-tip into your ear when you hear a few of them, because then you don't have to hear them again. Maybe extreme case, but you know, it happens. Take a listen, and you'll hear what I'm talking about, I hope. Music surprisingly may be my favorite thing about Fight Night. A lot of it reminds me of old action games on the 8 and 16-bit systems in terms of their composition, not necessarily the sort of bitness to the music, but also has a good collection of different instruments and styles used here. What it does fantastically is capture energy into battles while staying themed to the level. The Aqueduct level has a smooth underwater wave nature to it, for example. And up and down the music is something that I'll listen to while I'm coding going forward. Take a listen and hear what I'm talking about. In the end, Fight Night is going to be a game that's very, very polarizing for a multitude of reasons. It has strong elements in enemy variety, some good puzzle design, and overall is a game that uniquely stands out with some of its visuals and aesthetics. It's also a game that has traps that can easily drag down the system for certain types of players. If you get easily frustrated, you're going to have a bad time. You'll have a better time if you have a guide going into the game, and it's a game that if you play the first 2 hours on, you'll probably be happy and ready for the next 2, only for the game to start falling apart on you in certain ways. It's a very hard game to score from a buyability standpoint because its problems lie so much in the interconnectivity of the mechanics. But in the end, for me, the game earns a 70 out of 100, making it a niche genre buy, or just wait for a sale. That, however, does not take into account my enhancer system, which takes the more subjective elements of the game and matches the game to you. If you fall into one of the following categories, add or subtract that score to the main score. If the first digit of your score changes, refer to this chart to see if the game lies in the buyability score for you. Now, in the case of Fight Night, you'll notice that there's a lot more enhancers than normal. In fact, I had to mess around with the actual display on the screen in order to get things to fit. And that's because that has to do with the polarizing nature of the game. Some people will find a game that they really enjoy. Some people will find a game that they absolutely hate. And that's part of the strength of this review system. That's it for this review. If you liked the review, hit that like button. And if you didn't like the review, well, leave a comment down below. I'll leave a comment below either way, because the dislike button doesn't mean anything anymore for YouTube. I really should go into a rant on that one of these days, but, you know, not the place for it. Coming up next on the channel is a video that most everybody looks forward to on this channel every year. It's the top overlooked games of 2021. It will have 20 games most likely. That's a lot of content to go through, and I'm hoping to have it done before Christmas. The fact is, there's a lot of games to go through, and I know people want to use that as a buying guide for the Steam Winter Sale, but again, a lot of games to go through for the entire year. So, hopefully I have it done before Christmas, or at least during the sale itself. Anyway, that's it for now, and as always, keep on gaming.